I'm the Vice President of UrbOx, and I would like to welcome you all to the first event in our series of webinars discussing urban design, the past, the present, and the future. So the structure of the event will be as follows. We'll be hearing from both of our guest speakers, Andrew Raven and Robert Huxford, followed by a short discussion after both talks. So please note down any questions you've got or put them in the chat, and then we can discuss them at the end. We hope these webinars bring some insight into urban design for those who are new to it. And for those who are experts, we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us. The biggest advantage of being able to deliver a virtual event is to be able to hear from great urban designers from everywhere, who have kindly offered their time to be here this afternoon. Robert Huxford, who we'll be hearing from first, is the director of the Urban Design Group. He's the co-founder of the Public Realm Information and Advice Network and a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers Municipal Expert Panel. Robert will be talking about the pre-pandemic world. But before I ask Robert to start, please can everyone ensure that their mics are muted, and also you can have your cameras on or off, but also to let everyone know that this event is being recorded. So thank you very much, and over to you, Robert.
Hello, thank you very much. I'll just attempt to share my screen. Could you let me know if that's up and running?
Yeah.
Pre-pandemic planning, design and engineering. So anyway, I've been introduced and thank you very much. Delighted to be here. Delighted also that the sun's shining, which is a bit of a change. Well, there's always been planning, engineering and design. This is Rochester High Street. This is actually the line of the Roman road that we call Watling Street that runs between Canterbury and London. And it appears, a reference to this street appears in a Saxon land charter dated to the 24th of April, 604. The street was marking out a boundary, a land boundary, where the currently the cathedral and castle are to be found. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's sometimes a tendency to think that planning and design, it has a ground zero, something to do with Ebenezer Howard, and nothing much happened before that. But I mean, the fact is, if anytime anyone builds something, there is an element of thinking that goes on beforehand. So that's one of the things that I'd like to emphasize, and it's been going on for such a long time. Can anyone tell me where this is? You get a prize if you can guess where it is. It's not far away from Oxford. Anybody? Begins with a W.
Is it Wallingford, Robert?
Exactly, and the prize is you've just won Wallingford. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So Wallingford, this is 890, and it's the perimeter at the very least is based on some sort of calculation of the number of people that were expected to be clustered inside, so that there are enough blokes with spears to man the walls, roughly 4 blokes for every 5 meters. That's planning. Winchelsea. This is a new town created under the reign of Edward I, about 1292 onwards. The old Winchelsea having been destroyed by coastal erosion, and it's rigorously planned and designed. The main streets appear to be 2 rods or 3 rods of right. Crumbs, I can't say rods. A rod is roughly 5 meters, just over 5 meters. So the north-south streets are slightly wider. They would have run down to the harbour, and the cross streets, rods, 33 foot wide, apparently. So was health a consideration? Well, I think what has happened is, in the absence of knowledge about what causes disease, you can't really react to it. So, you know, the whole business of Newtown building came to an abrupt halt with the arrival of the Black Death, and it didn't go away. So not only did it kill about 1/3 to a half of the population, it kept the population down for many centuries afterwards, so that there was practically no Newtown building for about 200 years afterwards. and there are other diseases as well. It's so constantly there's a battle against the environment, I think you could call it. But in the absence of knowledge, how do you react? One of the things I think caused the population to start to increase significantly is the arrival of the potato, much underestimated and maligned root vegetable. So it got vitamin C in it. It's a brilliant source of low-cost calories, can be grown on fairly marginal land, and by bringing in vitamin C in a diet that would be otherwise pretty low in vitamin C, it's quite probable that it improved the reproductive success of the population. Some sources say that about a third of the urbanization that occurred in the 18th century was due to the arrival of the potato, the urbanization in Western Europe. So I think that the point here is that we look for grand gestures and big figures in society, politicians, kings, queens, whatever, making changes. But it's the conditions, the diet, the lifestyle of the population as a whole that is the driving force, and not these big people. Moving forward, so we've got Maryport here, 1749, a new town created by Act of Parliament. So we're now into an era where the population has properly recovered and is expanding, and it's filled the spaces that had been occupied by the population of 1347. So here you see a planned grid. It's well surveyed by the 1600s. At the end of the 17th century, there were sophisticated surveying implements. Logarithms have been invented, which is in effect the computer of the day. It allows you to do difficult multiplication and division. You can work out land areas precisely using these techniques. So this sort of rigidity and accuracy of planning and design becomes possible. So there we go, Maryport. It's in the Lake District. If you go up to the Lake District next, well, whenever we can, do drift over there. It's on the west coast. Have a walk around, see what you think of the place. Its streets, they're all uniformly spaced. The building line is 36 foot apart. The carriageway is 24 foot, and the footways are 6 foot. Now these are significant dimensions as they were picked up and moved forward in the Victorian period. They became pretty standardized. I'm sorry if they're in feet. So 24 foot is 7.3 meters, and 36 foot I think is 11.2 meters. 6 foot is 1800 millimeters. It's easier to quote them in feet because the measurements were in feet. 7.3 meters doesn't really sound quite so easy to assimilate. Anyway, so that standard, that cross-section became pretty much universal, or not universal, but national, should we say. So let's move into the 19th century. So the population now is rapidly expanding. There have been rapid advances in agriculture. Food production has increased. The population has increased. The Industrial Revolution is providing new job opportunities in towns, and people are moving into towns which are increasing in density. That it's to take advantage of the higher wages. The wages that were offered to the rural poor were pretty low, and people weren't so much compelled to go into towns, but there was a prospect of a better living, albeit at the risk of really awkward and difficult public health conditions. So I mean, the life expectancy in Manchester in the first half of the 19th century, I think at birth you'd be lucky to survive to the age of 30. It's quite shocking. There were theories that were being advanced as to the cause of disease, and at the beginning of the century, miasma was the prevailing theory. the notion that disease was caused in some way by bad air. Germ theory had yet to be advanced and established, and this wouldn't be till later in the 19th century. So yeah, there were notorious episodes like the Great Stink. It was picked up in cartoons. So I think that's a cartoon from Punt 1855 on the left-hand side. So major problems, little political action. And the reason is it's going to cost a lot of money, and people in power don't particularly like spending money. There are engravings that illustrate the sorts of conditions. This particular engraving is often used by people to illustrate slums, but these aren't slums. They're actually built to fairly high standards for the time. The party walls between the houses extend above the roof line, and that's there to prevent the spread of fire. The air quality, though, would not have been good. Anyway, so more cartoons, more illustrations, an illustration of overcrowding in buildings. And that's a example of well, what we would call it in today's term, a home in multiple occupancy, a model that's in Manchester, the Manchester City Library. So I think there was something like 70 people living in that house, where now I would imagine you'd get, well, it would be 3 flats, wouldn't it? Probably. So yes, life expectancy, not good. Deaths from infections, very, very high, until the 20th century. And it's said that we've been living, maybe, say from the middle of the 20th century onwards, up until now, in a period where we seem to have avoided epidemics. It's disappeared off the radar, and we've maybe been lulled into a false sense of normality. And yet, I mean, if you think over the past decade, we've had MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, that's believed to be caught from camels. There's been SARS coronavirus 1. We've had Zika virus. And we've also, if you go back 7 years, there's also been a volcanic episode with that volcano that blew in Iceland. And that stopped flights for, several weeks. Volcanoes have, if you back over a long period, they are very significant in terms of causing trouble for the human race at a global scale. I think it's 816, the year without a sun, believed to be being caused by a volcano in Southeast Asia. Anyway, we move on. So what are the issues? Tuberculosis, that is believed to have caused about 40% of mortalities. Typhoid, cholera, typhus, rickets, and we've got these theories. Rickets, that was a problem. It came to the fore in about 1900. Lack of vitamin D in the diet, as well as air pollution stopping sunlight getting through to people living in urban areas, caused by the amount of air pollution. You've seen the photographs of Victorian towns, and they're often fuzzy. And I used to think that was because of the poor quality of the cameras, but eventually, after about 50 years, I realized it's because of all the smoke that was around. It was a pretty appalling environment. And rickets is a disease that's re-emerging now. So what was the reaction? There were campaigners, there were visionaries, people like somebody called Edwin Chadwick, who really pioneered what became known as a public health movement. He produced reports on the sanitary conditions of the working classes. He was a passionate and very focused advocate for better conditions. But one of the motivations, perhaps the prime motivation, was economics, because if your population is ill, it's not going to be very productive. It's better to have people who are well from an economic point of view. It's rather a hard approach, but that was one of the main driving forces. So we see a set of legislation that comes through. There was the Public Health Act of 1875, and what followed on from that was the model bylaws. The Public Health Act set up something called the Local Government Management Board, and it gave them powers to create model bylaws, which then urban councils were had to comply with. The urban councils would then set up their own bylaws for the creation of new buildings and new streets. And so in the model bylaws, you have building regulations and planning and street design all rolled into one, and drainage and sewerage and the operation of markets and the disposal of waste, all a wide range of things. So hugely important and hugely integrated. We are in a world now, a professional world, where things are not integrated. Everything is divided. We've got separate specialists for drainage, for traffic signals, for highway engineering, for lighting. Nothing joins up very easily, and it's why in the planning and urban design world it's so important that there is a broad education, and we have experience and at least a knowledge of the issues in these different particular specialisms. So what are they saying? Minimum widths of streets 36 foot or 40 foot in London. That followed on from the London Building Act of 1894. Prior to that, in about the 1830s, there'd been minimum requirements for the widths of the street of 30 foot. It also covers ventilation and light. The model building codes require that the area of window should be at least 1/10 of the floor area. And last year, you'll have, I guess, have noticed in under these plans, the permitted development to turn it's Watford, turn factories and office spaces into residences. There were flats that were being proposed that had no windows at all, and of course, under the model bylaws of 1877, this wouldn't have been allowed. So sometimes it's worth carrying forward some of this legislation and bearing in mind what it was there to address. I won't go into these bylaws in any particular more detail, but I think I've got some pictures for you to see, so you can see what was entailed. So here, there's a relationship between the heights of the buildings and the size of the backyards. The idea there is to make sure that the light can get into the backyards, light and ventilation. And don't forget, the white background, don't let that fool you into it being clean air. It would have been smoky, very, very smoky indeed. There was no such thing as smokeless fuels in those days. And there's another illustration, creating a diagonal line that limits the height of buildings in relation to the depth of the backyard. In Scotland, there were things called the Borough Police Acts, and there was legislation that limited the heights of buildings to 1 1/4 times the width of the street. There was a great passion for creating parks. Some of the Victorian parks that were created at the time, it seems that they've become a very important lung and a space in this era of lockdown. Why they were created, I think one would have to look more into the power structures and the wealth that existed in society at the time, and how people viewed their reputation and what would advance it. So it's not always to be seen as a charitable act. It's worth examining the deep underlying motives for these things. Clissold Park, there we have it again. So anyway, can anyone tell me where this is? Anybody?
Oxford.
It's in Oxford. It's in Jericho, Victor Street, and I think, well, I'm going to suggest this street was created in about 1850. It's 30 foot wide. So it's, I believe, I'm guessing, but it's being controlled by some sort of bylaw. So it's controlling the design of the houses and the width of the street. And then you have a grid. The bylaws, bylaw housing, often it was created around a grid, but they didn't have to be around a grid. It's often the case that a developer will, confronted by legislation, will design to the minimum required by the legislation, and a grid is, well, I guess it's a fairly efficient way of squeezing in houses, as opposed to having a wide landscaped streets with trees, etc. This street does have trees, but no, they're on the on private land, and so currently there's a political aspiration to have tree-lined streets. We don't necessarily want tree-lined streets everywhere, and the best streets are not always tree-lined. Oxford High Street, in particular, it's got one huge tree in the middle, which has a great impact. Here, having two big trees that close off the view, it has quite a powerful effect in terms of greening the street. If you had street trees all the way along, that might not be such a good solution for this width of street. How about this? Can anyone give me an idea when this street might have been created? Any volunteers? You know where this is. Of course you do. No, nobody's volunteering. Well, I think if we go along the street, you can have a look at the buildings and maybe have a guess at the age. And I think, whoops, it's later into the 19th century, although it says New High Street. So I mean, maybe this was a pre-existing route that was then normalised. It's 40 foot wide between the building line on the left and the garden walls on the other side. So it's the same width as in the required by the London Building Act. So I don't know whether Oxford at the time had adopted bylaws that required streets to be a minimum of 40 foot wide, but maybe they did. And there you have it. And there's a 40 foot wide street created in London under the London Building Act of 1894. So we've got a footway, we've got a carriageway of 24 foot or 7.3 meters. Why 24 foot? Why 7.3 meters? It was, so they said at the time, so that you could have a vehicle parked on either side of the carriageway, and there still be space for a third vehicle to go down the middle. And there you've got 100 years after the street was built, vehicles parked all down either side and still space to go down the middle, albeit only in one direction at a time. So there, wider streets, a bit more ventilation, tree planting, a greener environment, a bit more space for to be able to do this. And in the first photo, there's a lot of children around, no cars. And in the second photo, lots of cars and no children. So is this a reflection of we've created a hostile environment that's driven children off the street? Well, yes, that's true. but also in this street today, there would be far, far, far fewer children. And that's largely because of the way the population profile has changed. By eliminating disease, largely, we've created a population structure where most years, the population in each year of age is more or less the same. Whereas in the 1900s, you'd get a lot of 1-year-olds, a few less 2-year-olds, and infectious disease would shave off the population so that very relatively few people would be surviving beyond 60 or 70. So it's worth bearing in mind the population pyramid that existed at these respective times. It gives a little bit more insight. They're not directly comparable. So there is Elborough Street, and there you can see it sitting in a grid. Providing sunlight. This is a drawing that was created by a borough engineer of Cambridge at about 1820. And there he's trying to demonstrate that by increasing the width of a street from that 40-foot limit to 70 foot, you can get sunlight on Christmas Day getting into the ground floor rooms. And at the same time, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about the Garden City movement, about leafy suburbs, about addressing overcrowding. So maybe that movement then provides a foundation for low-density suburbs, car-based suburbs that start to appear in the 1930s and are with us now. So abandoning the grid approach, what I think then happens from about 1920s onwards, in the seeking after more spacious, greener environments, we get suburbs being built, and what I call municipal geometric style. So it's where you get a street layout that's it's based on patterns very visible from plan view. You get crescents, concentric circles, symmetrical shapes, axes that are built. The snag is, these look great from plan view, and you can imagine that a plan for that being presented to the town hall, and the mayor and the councillors being in raptures about it. But when you actually see it on the ground, it's inconsequential because the architecture isn't strong enough to emphasize the shapes. And if you turn that into a row of Regency housing, like one of the crescents in Bath or maybe in Edinburgh, it would be spectacular. But somehow the semi-detached housing, it breaks up the line. There's not really a sense of this being a crescent. So here we go, back to Oxford. I think there's some suggestion of municipal geometric style, maybe by the Eastern Bypass, the top right-hand side, but I'm not entirely sure. It's starting to look more like the 1950s style of development, where there's an effort to keep traffic out of residential areas and constrained onto distributor roads. I'm not going to say anything about distributor roads because Graham Smith is the world's leading expert on distributor roads. I'm not going to embarrass myself. Perhaps he will say something in the discussion. We can move to Bicester, and so I'm just moving on to the modern era now, in preparation for Andrew, who's going to talk about things like the current consultation on the National Model Design Code. So Bicester, post 1950s, we seem to have switched over to an era which is principally around designing for the efficient, congestion-free movement of vehicles. And it's reflected in highways design, but it's also reflected in the planning system, with the planning system not stopping and potentially aiding and abetting the creation of car-dependent development. Bicester is quite an outrageous example, and this is the very centre of Bicester, centre of the ring. It looks like that, and I think it's is it 7 lanes of traffic at this point, where this could have been a vibrant town centre or extended town centre or a boulevard. It's not great, and this has health implications in many different ways. This one, smack in the middle, I think this is between Bicester and Buckinghamshire. Buckingham is a development called Calvert. I think it's on an old brickworks site, so it's brownfield land, and the planning system at the time said it's good to develop brownfield sites. It's smack in the middle of a medieval landscape of nucleated villages, which would have been surrounded by open fields. If you want to make a car-dependent development, this is the exact location to do it. And the people who live here will work on the M4 corridor or around the M25. Their lives are totally dependent on car ownership and use. And with that comes the attendant problems of lack of exercise, obesity, type 2 diabetes. Oh yes, well, they're all there. Road safety issues, because those people have to drive through the surrounding medieval villages to get onto the trunk road network, and they're going to be traveling at high speeds. The lanes are shared spaces. There's no footways. It turns those into death traps for pedestrians and cyclists. I think that is the last slide. What's the message? We've always had epidemics. Our knowledge of what's caused them has conditioned how we responded to them. And there are other epidemics as well that we shouldn't lose sight of. So I'm going to shut up. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that wasn't too painful. And I'd like to hand over to Andrew, who's going to bring us up to date and take us into the future.
Yes, I'd just like to say thank you to Robert. That was a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. So yes, now to talk about the post-pandemic city is Andrew Raven. So Andrew is head of the Savills urban design team in Oxford, and he is responsible for leading the team on major projects specialising in strategic housing, garden communities, regeneration projects, and business park redevelopment. So Andrew is going to be talking about post-pandemic city planning. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ingrid. Just to add a bit to that, I'm probably going to scoot over quite a number of different topics. I don't have any slides. So what I thought I would do is raise as many issues as I can. Robert certainly ran through a massive history in a very short period of time. So well done. That was very interesting. And I've learned plenty, actually. So if you me in the corner of the screen stuff, as I go along, I'm going to introduce a number of different things, I hope, talk for about 15 minutes and then have plenty of time for questions. So if you want to focus in on certain things I'm talking about, make a note and drill back down into them afterwards. I think where Robert got us to a perfect point almost in talking about new pandemics, and before the current one, health was coming up the agenda in urban design anyway. The government and the NHS had realised that how we design places has a massive impact on health. And so about 2 or 3 years ago, the NHS ran a tender to create a new design guide. And they've since come out with some design documents. And part of the reason for that was the obesity epidemic, which has been recognised by all kinds of different councils across the UK and by highways authorities. most of whom have said we need to massively focus more on active travel, and most of whom have said that, but generally not managed to deliver very much of it at all. So health was coming up the agenda, and design for healthy places. Change was happening very slowly, I think. And then COVID-19 hit, and that change started to be accelerated. And there's some good that's come out of it. Generally, of course, it's been pretty bad and pretty miserable. I know it has for me. But there have been some good things to come out of it. So I just wanted to sort of to touch on those issues. Generally, the trend had been towards shopping more online, and that had been killing our high streets. And unfortunately, that's massively increased. But there was also a trend towards working from home. People wanted to manage their work-life balances better. They wanted to work in more mixed-use areas. Some of the top tech companies have been studying what the workforce want and how they want to live the past 2 to 5 years, with lots of information emerging on, what they call the population groups, so millennials and Gen Z, and understanding that people now don't tend to want to commute to work long distances if they can avoid it. They don't want to work in single work areas. So you've got companies like Microsoft who can absolutely pack full their offices in London and Manchester, but in Reading, where they've got an out-of-town office that's in a single-use business park, they can only get about a third of their employees to turn up because it's out of town, and their employees want to be in amongst where all the action is happening. And so those places potentially are ripe for a greater mix of uses. And we've seen that kind of lifestyle change massively accelerated over the last 12 months. So people have obviously stopped commuting long distances. And I think it was probably about 10 or 11 months ago now where you started to see some really, really brilliant images online of cities across the world and how they've changed in terms of their air quality in particular, but linked to traffic movements. And I mean, we're in a great time for urban design and planning at the moment because there's so much data available. So it's brilliant. It's all about marshalling that data and how you can use it to predict what's going to happen and see what's happening now, test things out. So it's been pretty exciting to see all of that. And you've got companies like TomTom and Strava releasing a lot of their data. So TomTom do a kind of congestion index across the world. It's been interesting to see how that's been changing. And Strava, of course, showing how many people are now commuting to work either on foot or by bike. And we're seeing Boris bikes used for longer distances now as well because people don't want to use public transport so much. So we're kind of seeing a return back to walkable neighbourhoods and active travel, which is what a lot of us in the urban design world have been promoting for years and years, but really struggling against what has become a car-dominated society. And it's really interesting in the system how all of that works. I've just done a series of about 8 evenings of consultation with parish councils. And most of the people that are on those parish councils are probably 60 or older. And it's my generation and their generation that have been used to driving everywhere and probably believe that it's a right to be able to do that. And yet you get 1 or 2 people who will complain about the amount of traffic and say, and I'm not part of it. But a lot of them will be part of that traffic and have caused some of the problems that we now see in terms of congestion and air quality. So moving back towards walkable neighbourhoods has been a really interesting phenomenon. you've seen people shopping much more locally, and I suspect that has helped a lot of village shops to actually regenerate, because plenty of villages have seen shops and pubs close, but particularly shops, because people are commuting out of the village to go to work, buying their shopping in a supermarket or having it delivered, and the local shop's not used, and they're surprised when the local shop closes, but it's actually due to their own lack of use quite often. And I've worked on some consultations with shopkeepers where we've actually tried to keep it open and leafleted whole villages to tell them, you know, this will close if you don't support it, and eventually they have closed because that was the general direction of travel in terms of behaviour. So coming back to the sort of walkable unit, and I'll just give a quick description of that. We can come back to it. But if you kind of take a walkable distance of about 400 meters, 5-minute walk, most people are prepared to walk that distance. And that would, if you drew that on a plan, it would give you a circle, and you do the kind of pi r squared calculation for the area of that circle, and you get about 50 hectares for 400 meters or 80 hectares for 500 meters. And depending on the amount of green space, that's enough to deliver you about 1,000 homes, maybe 1,500 homes, depending on density. And that's enough to support a primary school. 400 homes is enough to support a shop. So when you're up to 1,200 homes, you should have a small range of local shops and a primary school. And when you put those two together, it creates a kind of community gravity, and it reinforces the commercialism of the local centre, and it helps community because people are dropping their children at school, meeting with each other, at the same time using the local shops. And so that kind of unit is the basic unit of a village almost. And you probably heard Mayor of Paris and all kinds of other leaders across the world kind of reinvigorating the 15-minute city, which is basically a series of those small villages that have all joined together, and one of them towards the centre or on the best travel intersection where most people can arrive easily. That becomes the town centre where you deliver kind of higher order goods that aren't accessed so much, like swimming pools or an ice rink, or you know, more regional shopping functions. So the pandemic world has encouraged a move towards walkable neighbourhoods, which has been brilliant, and most authorities have been encouraging that with changes to streets. So Oxford's done a certain amount of work in trying to create streets that are more pedestrian friendly, and changing the way cafes operate and spill out onto the streets. St Michael's is one in Oxford. Reading has been closing some of its streets to two-way traffic and making them one way, so you've got room for cyclists on the other side of the street. Brighton's done its share. There are plenty of examples across the country, with some of them greening streets as well to make them more pleasant to sit out in. So all really good things. And as lockdown started to lift last year, before it got closed again, you could see the slow rise in the numbers of longer journeys and journeys by car that were being made. And it was a time at which we were seeing a kind of start of a bounce back to pre-pandemic activity, poor amounts of physical activity in terms of active travel. And of course, we've since been locked down again. So there's an opportunity to try and embed these things. And there's been changes in legislation that have helped with that. So the acts that allowed street changes relatively quickly, a lot of local authorities have used those to test out new ideas. And I think that's a real key to delivering change, to be able to test things and say that they've not worked and they were wrong, and be given the remit to do that. It's what they did in Henley with the town square. big consultation on whether they should remove traffic from part of, I think it's called Falaise Square. And most of the local traders really didn't like the idea, but they tried it out. They just put some temporary bollards up. People stayed for longer, the environment became nicer, they actually spent more money, the trade were really pleased about it, everyone liked a better environment, and so it was implemented. And it's exactly what the mayor, the principal transport officer did in Times Square in New York. I can't remember her name, but if you haven't seen it, she does a brilliant TED talk about how she persuaded the mayor to accept changes to a lot of the streets and pedestrianise some of them. So yeah, we've seen a lot of that happening, a return to walkable lifestyles, and it's something that we should try and keep and encourage in the way we design things in the future. So what do we want to do? We want to ensure that there's a mix of uses locally. A lot of local centres have died. And it's been a difficult time for the high street. So bringing employment back, but also housing into some areas. You know, London, of course, has suffered the opposite way around. It's been the big pull. And because people aren't commuting into London, there's opportunities to change some of the uses and recreate local neighbourhoods in some areas, creating more residential properties where it's more single-use office. Making active a priority. It isn't something that legislation has dealt with very well. Robert and I were talking before about the update that's coming for Manual for Streets. I got really excited when Manual for Streets first came out. Manual for Street 1 was something like 2008, 2010. I and one of the transport officers from Oxford City did a series of presentations to different groups, and I was really excited that there would be change in the way we design our streets, and they could again become places where people meet and socialise and not just transport corridors. Robert was talking earlier about people playing out in the streets, and about 15 years ago I used to ask people, did you play out in the street, and do your children? Because I know that when I was younger, people were all over the streets, but now it's considered too dangerous. And that's a big issue in terms of highways, that people are very concerned about safety, when perhaps sometimes it's about asking drivers to behave better and reinforcing social behavioural patterns to discourage driving. I think those issues also apply to, for instance, the design of schools, where, as an example, I designed an extension to a town in West Oxfordshire that had a lot of cycling networks, and so we designed it as a walkable neighbourhood with a primary school that was accessible on cycle routes from just about everywhere, and you could cycle to so easily, and it was walkable within 5 minutes of 750 all the new houses. The council says, and you must deliver 80 car parking spaces to go to school because people will drive. Well, there wasn't a necessity for people to drive. The idea was that we should provide for their behaviour. And it's an interesting conundrum, because that might be seen as social engineering if you don't provide those car parking spaces and try and force people to walk. But that's effectively what we're doing all the time. We design places, we're impacting and affecting people's behaviour. And it might be that the solution with those kind of things is for the headmistress or headmaster to tell their children, to tell their parents to stop driving them to school. And many schools have done that. A massive campaign in Glasgow over the last 18 months that hugely improved the number of children walking to primary school, and is improving their own life chances. And it's interesting that that life chances were reducing, certainly in our country, due to inequality issues. I think generally people weren't, the maximum age range of people was starting to drop. So designing better streets is going to help, and delivering better density. You need a reasonably high density to generate enough activity in a small area that will support things like shops. So if you've got a very low density 400-meter circle, you might only be able to provide 600 homes instead of 1,000, and those 600 homes will generate less people and less economic activity to support what's going on in the heart of your scheme. So density is quite important, and of course in the larger scale of things, density helps to support public transport networks. So that's a kind of potted history of where we've got to and what we might need to do to try and improve health and retain the active lifestyles that we've moved towards. I'll briefly talk about the changes that are coming in terms of new design standards and the now model design code, which was published just a couple of weeks ago. And we can drill down into any of these things in questions afterwards. So I'll just do maybe 5 minutes on this. I think it was right at the end of January, the government published the National Model Design Code, which follows on the heels of the National Design Guide, and it uses the same principles that are set out in the guide. With it came some changes to the National Planning Framework, which is the kind of overarching planning system, and some interesting changes they are, because they put beauty into the heart of the planning process, which is a hot topic of debate, because beauty is in the eye of the beholder. If you survey a lot of people, they might agree on some things that are beautiful, but people do disagree on beauty as well. And if you get the chance, I think his name is Zach Simons or Zach Simmons. He's a barrister from, I think, Landmark Chambers, but you can look him up. If you look up Zach Simons' beauty blog, he's written a really excellent blog on the dangers of putting beauty into the planning system. But the reason for that is there seems to be so much ugliness, so many developments that are really poor quality. And over the last 18 months, there's been quite a few audits that have said the quality of what we're building in the UK is either mediocre or poor generally. Well, it's just a disaster. It's so upsetting to hear that, and that change has been so slow. In my career, I think we've seen in the 90s, it was a pretty bad period for urban design, and the discipline was just emerging. I think that's probably when Brooks started its course. And things have got better. We're seeing really good quality development come out of the ground. But the winners of the Wolfson Prize, UrbEd, said in one of their statements about building better, building beautiful, why is it so difficult to build something that's really good? You're fighting against the system. And that is the reason for the changes that are being proposed. The Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission gave its report to government. Government pretty much endorsed it. And whilst a lot of the wider changes that were proposed to the planning system seem to have been delayed, the proposals for Building Beautiful are coming forwards. There's a specific reference now in the planning policy framework to DB 32 saying it absolutely should not be used to design streets. It was a highways guide that really focused on allowing cars to travel as quickly and safely as possible without running anyone over. There's a requirement to assess things for beauty applications. There's a requirement to put more codes and guidance, design codes and design guidance in place. There's a requirement for street trees, which Robert was referring to earlier, which will really put the cat amongst the pigeons, because proposing street trees causes problems for both developers and highways authorities. As Robert said, it can be a really tricky issue, delivering trees and the cost of them. But they're certainly in a lot of situations going to make our streets a lot nicer. And the other requirement is for consultation. And really interesting that they've said, if these proposals go through, you need to be able to show measurable support for your scheme. What does that mean? I noticed there was someone from Ipsos Mori on the sort of steering group or the stakeholder group for the Beauty Commission, and I did wonder, does that mean we're going to start surveying people for whether something's beautiful or not? How are we going to say what's measurable? And I think it will be, and what's suggested is that it depends on the scheme and how big it is, but there could be a variety of different tools, including online tools, which might include voting techniques and different forms of online workshops, inquiry by design. So really interesting moment to be an urban designer and a planner. I'll be quiet now, it's 3 o'clock, and let you fence some questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So we're going to take some questions now, but I just wanted to say that in the chat, Cameron has shared quite a few links about things that Andrew was talking about, so make sure that you check them out. Laura has asked a question in the chat, so I'm going to start with that, if that's okay. I'll just read it out here. It says, a question for both speakers. I'm interested in the changes that are currently taking place in terms of traditional uses for building types. For example, do the speakers think that there will be more of a focus on reusing buildings in the town centre or residential rather than building new towns or expansions? If so, would the planning system need to look at things like applying much higher taxes on empty buildings to help with the process? In Brazil, we have a planning instrument called the social function of the property, which means if a building isn't being used, it is taxed so much that it becomes economically not viable. Would something like this be viable in the UK to free properties in the city centre for residential use? Thank you.
Interesting question. Shall I go first, Robert? I think we are going to see reuse of buildings. Government's introduced quite a lot of policies that allow flexible reuse, and some of them have caused serious problems. I think Robert was referring before to change of use of offices to residential, and the survey work that's been done on those schemes has shown that there have been quite a number that have had created really poor residential environments. But also that flexibility is going to allow high streets to adapt. So yeah, I think that's a really good thing. I think there probably do need to be changes to tax regimes. It's not an area where I'm an expert, but quite interestingly, I think Nicholas Boyce-Smith, who is running so he's Create Streets, and they have a website really worth following. Lots of good research. It's a charity, and they've been advising lots of other charities and government, and he's of course the chair at the moment of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and he knows a lot about the tax system, and there might well be changes coming to the way we tax buildings and different uses. So I mean, the government obviously has been considering taxes for online shopping, because the rents that shops pay in the high street make them a lot more inefficient commercially compared to online. So you know, maybe those changes will happen, but also yeah, reuse and new build have different tax regimes, and encouraging conversion and reuse has got to be something that we should be doing more of.
I think those points are well made, and I think what you haven't posed a question, you posed a solution. there's a tendency to think that the planning system can provide all of the solutions when it's a tool, and it's a very important tool, but it's not the only tool, and it can't address all of the problems on its own. The taxation regimes are very much out of balance. So one of the main problems with reusing buildings is VAT. The VAT on new build is 0 rated. On reuse, renovations, improvement, enhancement of an existing structure, VAT is 20%. So it's an incentive, a perverse incentive, to demolish and rebuild. The system subsidizes roads. Grants are available for major road construction. And the underlying politics appears to favor mass house builders. I think there's one of the newspapers carried a story yesterday that since the Grenfell fire, the top 6 house builders have obtained either 5 billion or 10 billion pounds worth of profits. I think in economic terms they could be called supranormal profits. There are entry barriers that appear to stop small developers from entering the market. So when you get a chair of one of these large house builders netting, was it 70 million quid? Which is probably enough to cover all of their new houses in gold leaf for 1 year or something like that. It just seems to be a system that is not quite right. So we've got the taxation and subsidies to the construction industry, the house building in particular. There's also the way we price transport and permit people to drive at lethal speeds. So if, for example, we controlled car use, vehicle use, in the same way and to the same safety standards as public transport, so as the railways, we wouldn't permit people to drive down country lanes at 60 miles an hour. Long distance commuting would become very much different. If we introduced point of use charging, congestion charging or road user charging, it would make people think twice about using their vehicles. So I think you've raised a great issue there. The planning system is hugely important, but it needs to work hand in hand with taxation systems and other regulation systems.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions, discussion points? Feel free to unmute and chat.
Yes. What amazed me was the speed with which the COVID design guide was produced by government, indeed a restatement of it immediately. I was doing some lectures in Taiwan in January on Zoom and discovered this document. And I was talking to Taiwan about what the Japanese did during the war and what their legacy was. And it struck me that that design guide, though it describes temperature changes, and it uses the word temporary quite a bit, I'm just wondering what the speakers think will actually remain. Because the great fear is always that when something is temporary and yet involves hardware or redirection, pedestrians and behaviour, 2 years' time, how much of a legacy of this period are we going to still see in our high streets?
It's a difficult one because surveys, the kind of standard data on people's behaviour says it can be changed relatively quickly. But that's not what we saw with the surveys on transport. They were showing that most people were going to work from home a little bit more, and that's what they still show. People tend to want to work from home more now, and that's been reinforced. But there were quite a few surveys saying people weren't going to go back to public transport either, and that they would go back to commuting some long distances. So for me, it's about the local authorities trying to reinforce what's been good and what's worked. And it's a good time to be trying things out. But in Reading, we've seen where some streets were closed to cars, if you look online and listen to the general voices, it's all car drivers who are complaining about their right to drive their cars being curtailed. And maybe one local chap who says it's been really good for me and my daughter to cycle along this street now. So it does need people to change. I mean, fortunately, that's happening, but it's quite silly. And I think a lot of that is because of the politics of how we deliver planning. It is generally older people who are making decisions. And they'll, you know, in the example I referred to in West Oxfordshire, the local council said, well, why would we want to build any more cycleways? No one cycles. That's because they don't cycle and they don't know people who do. But there are plenty of people using them who are cycling. So it's about getting some of those issues raised up the agenda and heard a bit more. But yeah, as to what will stick, some of the really good councils are trying out ideas and trying to embed the changes to make them permanent. But politically, it is quite difficult.
But your perspective is that they're mainly good ideas. My perspective is many of them are bad ideas. We're talking about different sets of ideas. I think there could be greatly increased regulation in how the town centre is used, in terms of public spaces, in terms of barriers, in terms of access. It will come very easily after this. And that's what I'm concerned about.
You're concerned that there'll be barriers to access or...
barriers to access, less public space, less free use in public spaces, etc. The number of controls which exist in spaces are suddenly increasing, both with people telling people what to do, but also spaces being delimited and areas being delimited. It just seems to me many of those may stick.
I think yeah, sorry, you go.
No, go on, Robert.
Well, the de facto reality is that the barriers there anyway. The right to drive has extended right across the entire highway network. If you want to exercise your right to use the carriageway as a pedestrian, you stand a good chance of being killed. Even just walking on the footway, it's just short of 8% of pedestrian fatalities occur while the pedestrian is on the footway. Town centres, say Oxford High Street, it is currently a thoroughfare. It didn't used to be a thoroughfare, it used to be a market in the old days. It was a place, it was a destination, first and foremost. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind. I think the big changes, I think the high streets will look after themselves. The big changes are in the residential areas. So what the statutory guidance has enabled, and I wouldn't really call it a design guidance, I don't think. It very much leaves the local authorities to determine what they want to do. The Urban Design Group produced a traffic, what do we call it? A street improvement manual based on the statutory guidance. And there's lots of suggestions for cycle lanes, improving, reallocating road space. For example, in the interwar period, there were a lot of main roads that were created with a 30-foot width. This provides just about enough room to put in a 1.5 metre cycle lane on either side. There's practical measures such as that, but I think the main practical one is this notion of the low traffic neighbourhood, which has been given a huge boost by the statutory guidance. Local authorities have been trying them out. There is I would call it the right-wing libertarian press have continued to mount a campaign promoting the interests of the inverted commas long-suffering British motorist, selectively reporting anecdotes of people experiencing difficulties with low traffic neighbourhoods, such as the police not being able to attend stabbing incidents quickly. In terms of fatalities, the police pursuits led to 30 fatalities last year. There are significant dangers with being policed in that particular way. Low traffic neighbourhoods, Dr. Rachel Aldred, University of Westminster, has been undertaking a series of research projects looking at the impact of them. We're looking at a 70% reduction in road traffic accidents, a 10% reduction in crime, changes in people's behaviour, the reduction in loneliness, sense of community. There are huge numbers of benefits that follow on. At the moment, though, it is the vociferous objectors to low traffic neighbourhoods that are being publicised. The Daily Telegraph did not publicise Rachel Aldred's findings, neither did the Daily Mail, neither did the Daily Express, to my knowledge. The Guardian does. And unfortunately, the public's opinion is mediated to a degree by what they are told to think by the media.
Well, I think one of the biggest issues that the younger generation are facing at the moment, and I count my 2 kids in that, because I do want them to move out at some point, particularly after the last 9 months. And the cost of housing has been rising and rising for years because we haven't built enough. And whenever you have a consultation about building new houses, the objections come, there'll be too much traffic. I agree with building houses, but not here. And there is no recognition at the moment from the general public that we are the ones who cause the traffic and have bought houses relatively cheaply, but are now stopping a new generation from buying them cheaply. Not only are 20 to 30-year-olds supporting the health service for a massively bigger, older generation, but they're also paying for higher development costs caused by a lack of building, which kind of comes from traffic concerns and congestion concerns, amongst other issues, which have been caused by people that drive cars all the time. You know, you almost think it should be a right at a consultation to ask someone, before you object to this new scheme on traffic grounds, can you tell me whether you drive a car or not all the time? Because we need to share the problem of traffic. It shouldn't be new developments that can be stopped because of that issue. It's a problem we all have together. And I mean, for 30 years or more, there's been a presumption that if we build the infrastructure, everything will be okay. So we've built wider and bigger roads and more relief roads for better car travel. And of course, it just encourages more car travel. Road capacity gets filled up again. And what happens when that traffic hits the historic towns? It's a major problem potentially with the Oxford-Cambridge arc. Great that you build new houses and create new jobs across the arc. But if you're just delivering people to Oxford, Milton Keynes and Cambridge, what's going to happen when they get to Oxford? The last mile is a huge problem. And, you know, maybe a lot of those problems will be resolved by transport changes. You know, it becomes easier to jump out of a long distance autonomous vehicle and onto an electric scooter that you can pick up with your phone. Moving around could become much more easy, and I can see that happening relatively soon. About 5 years ago, transport engineers were saying in 5 years we'll all be in autonomous vehicles, and the 5 years before that they were saying in 5 years we'll all be in autonomous vehicles, and it's been quite slow to happen. But I was behind one in Oxford a couple of months ago, and I'm not slow, but I wanted to catch up to see if there was. I presumed there was someone actually sitting in the car, but I couldn't catch it. It was driving really safely, smoothly and quickly. So I think that that is on the horizon. And one of the things we're looking at in new schemes is how do we design them so that if people don't park cars around all the streets in the future, how can we make places flexible to deal with that? You know, can we create places for new employment pods or green spaces or bits of park that can replace car parking in the future?
May I ask?
Can I just add just a point of clarification? And this is relevant to Manual for Streets. The statutory guidance under it's issued under the Traffic Management Act, Network Management in response to COVID-19. The Traffic Management Act allows the Secretary of State to issue statutory guidance, and you have what does statutory guidance mean? You have to then go to the common law to find out what statutory guidance means, and it's broadly Parliament requires local authorities to follow the path charted by the Secretary of State's guidance, with liberty to deviate from it where the local authority judges on admissible grounds that there is good reason to do so, but without freedom to take a substantially different course. So that's what statutory guidance means. At least that's what it means if there are people who want to enforce local authorities' decisions. And one does that through judicial review. If then one switches over to Manual for Streets and street design, that's issued under the Highway Act. There are no powers that the Secretary of State has, Secretary of State for Transport, to issue statutory guidance to highway authorities. So Manual for Streets is guidance which the highway authorities can take, and as surveys by the Urban Design Group have shown, highway authorities, about 80% of them have left the Manual for Streets. They haven't updated their street design guidance to reflect the principles of Manual for Streets. And by doing that, they're ignoring the planning policy framework and planning guidance as well, and a raft of other legislation such as the Equality Act, Public Sector Equality Duty. So anyway, so that's just a very quick resume of the meaning of guidance, the difference between statutory guidance and all other sorts of guidance, and the whether a local authority has the freedom to ignore it or not. I hope that helps. It may confuse. Everybody's
clarify something. Yeah, can I clarify something when I asked the question? I was referring to COVID-19 secure, safe public places, urban centres and green spaces. Design manual for COVID-19 published by the government.
That's published by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry, I was.
It's its third edition, and it has interesting drawings of how streets might be redesigned to cope with COVID. And some of them are very concerning, especially if those structures exist after COVID. But I thought you ought to know what I was referring to.
Oh, right, that's how.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an example of joined up government, isn't it? So that the Department for Transport issue one set of statutory guidance,
Yeah.
the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government issue another set of guidance.
Probably the smartest design
do they
that
meet
I've ever
up?
used. Yes, it was amazing.
Yeah.
Very rapidly produced, very detailed. And has anybody actually used it?
That's a very good question.
That's what's governing how our towns are being designed at this moment. And it's in its, I think, third edition. It's online. Do you know it, Graham?
Offhand, no.
Well, it seemed to be the basis of the afternoon's discussion. It should have been. But I only found it because, as I say, I was asked to comment on the conservation of some buildings in Taiwan which were built by the Japanese. And I said, you've got to get into your mind what the Japanese were thinking when they constructed these buildings and these roads. Why did they do it? If you want to conserve anything about it, then get into their mindset. And I said, for example, and I produced this document and said, this is the mindset which is being used at this moment to manage our town centres. 50 years' time, will we still be able to find remnants of this? So that's what concerns me. The now And I agree, we're all talking about the now, but that's very specific, urban design now.
I think the Ministry of Housing Communities and Local Government guidance, I believe, was produced by Atkins or Arup, which I think the reality is that in most shire counties, there's been very little change in town centres. You'll probably, I don't know what's happened in, do I know what's happened in Oxford? When was I in Oxford last? December. I live in Kent. There's been no changes in the high street in town where I live, but the town as a whole has had a raft of 20-mile-an-hour limits imposed, and the county council are much to be applauded for having done that. I think the problem, and taking Andrew's points about car dependency, is that most shire counties, the socioeconomic system is aligned around car use. The shopping, the retail facilities are basically car-based. There's very little, comparatively little, you can obtain by walking. Village shops closing, and again on the employment side of things, there's the normal way of life to drive to where you work, maybe 10 or 12 miles. And with the Oxford-Cambridge arc, we've got Chalgrove, an airfield about, is it 12 miles to the south of Oxford, being proposed for 5,000 homes. There's not even a road network that has advanced substantially since the days of turnpiking in the 18th century. It's an absolutely crazy place to put 5,000 homes. The demands on the local road network, which is basically medieval or earlier, will be immense.
But the government owns the land.
Well, it's a brownfield site, so it's good.
The government owns the land, but that's why it's been offered.
Here, here.
I don't know to what extent students today know things like Design Bulletin 32 or Manual for Streets, but I share the criticisms of Design Bulletin 32, which was published in 1977. One of the reasons that Andrew might not realize for the publication of this fairly dreadful document is that it wanted to reduce the amount of road space given to cars. That was one of the key ideas of John Noble. And one of the examples that's quoted in the guidance and that informed the guidance is the Brow at Runcorn in Cheshire, where you find very narrow streets. It's actually instructive to go there. One of the and of course, Design Bulletin 32 also has a section at the back, the original version as well as the published version in 92, of studying how long a single carriageway road can be under different traffic conditions. In other words, how far apart the passing places need to be, or how long the passing places are. So, although it proposed distributor roads, which I hate and don't think should exist, we should have actively fronted roads that you might call boulevards rather than distributor roads. They could have their own street at the side. The thing I want to throw in conversation is that I went to see in the Netherlands a town called Houten near to Utrecht in the 80s when it was growing, and it's been reported on as one of the best new towns for cycling or walking and probably horse riding too in the world. I don't like the architecture of the place to a great extent. It looks a bit too suburban to me. But the point I want to make is that effectively it's a Design Bulletin 32 new town. It has a distributor road around the outside, most of which is quite narrow. It has no buildings facing the distributor road. It has cul-de-sacs coming off the distributor road, or cul-de-sac network like arrangements. One difference, the one massive difference between that development and every development in Britain is that the intention of the town was to make public transport very accessible. And the town is focused on a main railway line to Utrecht, and a new station was built on the main railway line to Utrecht. And at the bottom end of all of the cul-de-sacs, there's one huge axis that runs through parkland at right angles to the railway line, making it more convenient to use a bike to get to the station to commute into Utrecht or Amsterdam or wherever, and also to go to the shopping centre. And it's taken a long time to realise that the guidance that I hate, DB32, for destroying towns and generating car traffic, could actually be used almost unchanged to produce a massive amount of trip capture for local shopping, a massive percentage of journeys by bicycle, as well as being adjacent to the Dutch motorway network. And so that leads us to the question of what's in the mind, not in the guidance, but what's in the mind of people who are doing these things. And I suppose you didn't quite say old bastards, and now that I'm over a certain age, I can share the terminology, but what's presumably in many of those people's minds is as Andrew said, being able to use the car. We know that we know how to build places that don't need cars. You make them like Jericho in Oxford. You make it so that it's so convenient to go to Walton Street or to get into the centre of town that you don't need to use your car. Live just in South Oxford. I remember the NA man starting a neighbour's car one night a few years ago, saying, "We get a lot of call-outs for starting cars in places like this." He said, "People don't use their cars enough." So we know how to make places where people need cars. We've got guidance that the counties throughout the country are sticking to that we think is obsolete in car generating. But even that guidance can be made entirely different if you choose not to think that that it necessarily means zoning. Anyway, end of mini lecture.
Can I ask the students a question? Do you, on the whole, when you're judging distances, do you think in feet or meters?
Well, I haven't really been taught that feet.
So, I mean, the room you're in, how wide is it?
It must be about, width-wise, about probably like 5 meters, I'd say.
Right. Is everybody else in rooms that they would describe in meters?
No.
Rather than feet?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably.
And
Four
do you have
meters.
4 meters. Okay. And so intuitively, you see the world in meters and centimeters, and not in feet, or not both.
I think it depends. I think it depends where I am. I don't know anyone else, but I feel like, I don't know, if I'm somewhere where I can kind of roughly estimate it in meters, then I'll do it in meters. But I feel like some other places, because I don't know the conversions, I'm not very good at maths, but if I can estimate it in feet, then I'll just do it in feet.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I think, I mean, maybe we use the most convenient measurement at the time. I mean, you run 100 meters, so longer distances, maybe we think in terms of meters. I don't know. It's interesting though. So I know, and I'm sorry if by going on about feet with street widths, it's been a bit incomprehensible. But the trouble is, they were in feet, and you know, a 40-foot street is 13 point something whatever meters. I don't know. Yeah. Well, sorry about that.
I was also going to say, I think it depends how it also translates into software as well. For example, when you're using a SketchUp and such, or a CAD, obviously it depends what you're used to. Obviously they have the different modes where you can change between the metric and imperial systems, but I think once you started using only the metric, I think perhaps when you change to imperial, it's suddenly like, oh, the site is much bigger than I thought it would be, and perhaps it plays on your mind in that way. But obviously I think it also depends on where you are and what system they use in terms of internationally and such, because obviously all the information in terms of policy that they would provide you would be in that system, so obviously you'd have to adapt to that. Yeah,
it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, getting the scale of things. I think even in the new National Model Design Code, and do have a look at it, the some of the street trees seem to be remarkably small. And I think we often see that you know, street cross sections, people put in trees, and they're not really like that. They're toy trees rather than real trees.
Fastigiates, is that what they're called?
Bonsai.
On the issue of dimensions, I think the planning system requires us to use metric, and I've kind of been brought up with metric. As someone said, it's easier in the software to use, particularly AutoCAD, much easier to use metric figures. But the development industry still thinks in feet and acres. So I'll find myself on site with someone and they'll say, well, I think we could develop these 2 fields and it's about 120 acres, isn't it? And I'm quickly trying to work out, what is that in hectares? Is that right? If we all changed over at the same time, that would make life much easier, but perhaps less interesting. I've got to shoot off soon, but I've got a quick question. I just looked up on the internet the quote. I was trying to find the quote that Margaret Thatcher made about driving cars, and it was something like, if you're, by the time you're 35, you're still using public transport, you can consider yourself a failure. Because her view was, you're a failure if you don't have your own car. But you listen to is it the mayor of Bogota, who said that the real test of a great city is how good its public transport system is and how many people are willing to use it. And that seems to me to be a so much better approach. And just looking at online, my question was going to be, when you want to get somewhere, what do you think about first? Is it the car that's parked outside your house or where the nearest bus stop is? Or is it on your phone to look up what's going next and whether you get an Uber or a taxi or a bus?
I mean, personally, I just think about how I can walk to a destination. Because I don't have a car, so I just walk everywhere pretty much, or cycle. So yeah, it's about me.
Yeah, I think
it
for me, I'm at the moment I'm in Dubai, and it's very car dominated. Everyone, like, you sort of use the car to get to places. I'd say the metro, which is like public transport. For me, I think that's what I use because it goes to most places, or if not, you can then walk from there. But I think when I'm in Oxford, I think it's looking at the bus timetable because it's so convenient in Oxford. Yeah.
I would have to agree with Ingrid. I come from Jordan, and when I'm back in Jordan, I would never consider public transport because there isn't really any public transport. And even when you go on public transport as a young girl by herself, probably isn't very safe. So when I'm here at home in England, I would definitely think about public transport, walking, weather dependent. And then my last thought would be a car if I'm at a place where the car is. So I think it's very, very dependent on where I am. And but then when I go places like, got family who live in Austria, and when I go visit them, it's all public transport because of how good the public transport links are. So I think it's when it's available, people will use it. And then when it's not, people won't, because it's convenience. Where as people, we're inherently lazy. We want what's the most convenient, what will get us there the quickest, the closest to the place we're going, and the warmest, really. I
had a anecdotal experience. I live just off Abingdon Road near Folly Bridge, and I had to get to, I can't remember, I had to get to the Brooks, maybe to go to the dentist, or whether it was the Churchill Hospital. But anyway, it was in that area. And so I was waiting, and I've got a bus pass, which introduced me to the public transport system, which I'd barely used in my working life. And I was waiting at the bus stop, looking at the hard copy timetables and expecting the bus to come and expecting the bus to come. And nothing was coming. And eventually I thought, it's no good. I haven't got time to get the bus. I have to go home and use the bike. And of course, the bike is a reliable 17 minutes to get to Brooks. And the bus is plus or minus 20 minutes the other side of half an hour. It's remarkable.
Well, as Graham knows, you're
a non-cyclist.
I'm the urban designer who doesn't drive, so never have done. So it's very interesting. I feel very constrained at the moment. Especially not using trains. I have used the train once, but I'm also locked in, locked down, etc. And very deprived. And it's very interesting. A historian who I value greatly is me a map, which I wanted recently, last week. And it was just exchange of information for writing purposes. He wrote in another paragraph, it said, I haven't been to Banbury, which is where I live, for a year, and yet he is the historian of Banbury. He's written 4 or 5 books on it. I've been to Oundle. I'm missing towns. And I've written that to a number of people. One whole thing we haven't talked about is what people want from towns, behaviour in towns. If you can use academia, the website, I've got a paper there on personal space in COVID period in towns, and it's about what people demand of towns, whether they can demand that in the future. And it's something I'm exploring, really in the tradition of Kevin Lynch and other people who I worked with. This whole idea that the town is not just a retail environment, it's not just a confluence of traffic and pedestrians, it's a coming together of people to share things and to do things and to be seen and see. And all those things we've got to recapture, or someone will just and go. And I find that a very interesting area to explore. And I wish I could be out there looking at towns. I do have some thoughts which are unrepeatable on people using towns at the moment and how they use them.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to bail out, but I think that's a lovely thought about discussing the purpose of towns. And in fact, this may seem like a bizarre thing to do, but if you look up Plato, The Republic, Book 2, there's a discussion recorded about 400 years BC on why towns, why a city comes into being. Why do we need cities? And it's a very, very simple discussion, and it starts off with saying, why do we have cities? It's because we're in need. All of us have needs. And then if you get together and have a chat amongst yourselves or in a small group as to what you think ought to be in a city, in this particular example, they say, this is Socrates, he says, I think we need 3 things. We need food, we need shelter, and we need clothing. And so we need a farmer to provide the food, we need a builder to provide the housing, the shelter, and we need a weaver to provide the clothes. And then they have a discussion, well, would it be better if a farmer spends all his time farming and he gets somebody else to sell the food in a market? So, well, we need people in shops, retailers. It'd be best if we had a blacksmith, metal workers. So if you can have this discussion, but hold it in the 21st century and in the context of online retail and cafes and socialization, and I think it's really, really powerful. And it just starts off with a a simple question. Why does a city come into being? Why do we need cities? On which basis? Thank you very much. It's been lovely to meet you. The very best of luck in the future. And I don't know, maybe we'll meet again, and do take part in any urban design group events that you can spot. The next ones are going to be on the National Model Design Code, but they're not publicised at the moment. Anyway, good luck.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'd just like to say thank you to both Robert and Andrew for joining us for these talks. I think we'll draw this to a close and then we'll have next week's webinar. So I'd just like to say thank you to the both of them, and if we can give them a virtual round of applause. So thank you everyone for coming along. We look forward to seeing you next week for our second webinar. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you haven't stopped learning. I've learned loads of stuff from Mr. Smith and continue to. So there we go. And if you go outside, walk down the street, there's loads of stuff to learn just by looking at it. And as Brian said about, I think, trying to get behind, I mean, in relation to that MHCLG guidance, trying to get, what were people thinking about when they produced it? But you can do the same for any part of the built environment. What were people thinking about when they produced it? Anyway, there we go. Sorry, I've waffled on for far too long. Best of luck.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Well, it's great seeing everybody, isn't it, Graham?
It's lovely seeing everybody.